Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the CIB Presidential Seminar Series that we broadcast from Purdue University. As you all know that, the theme for this semester is regional directors and leaders in the construction industry from all over the world. And with that said, it is indeed an honor to have two very distinguished members of the global construction academic community, and that is Professor MPhil and Professor Theo Haupt. So let me give a quick introduction to both of them, and we might actually be joined by Professor Wayne Dry as well. So let's see if he has time to join the session today. Professor MPhil is a full-time academic staff at the University of Cape Town and was head of the Department of Construction Economics and Management from 2017 to 2020, and the Deputy Dean for the Undergraduate Studies, Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Engineering and Built Environment from 21 to 2023. Kathy holds a doctorate in Project and Facilities Management from the University of Salford in UK, an MPhil in Cost and Systems Engineering, and a BSc Honors in Quantity Surveying from the University of Cape Town. She is the director of the Sustainability-Oriented and Construction Research Unit for the Built Environment at UCT. She's a registered professional quantity surveyor and a member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, the Association of South African Quantity Surveyors, and the South African Facility Management Association. Kathy is a past president of the South African Council for Quantity Surveying Profession and served a 4-year term as a council member on the Council for Built Environment of South Africa. She was on the governing council of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, is a current member of the board of CIB, and a member of the International Facilities Management Association, and is a founding director of the African Facilities Management Association. Professor Theo Haupt, also a distinguished academic, is the South African National Research Foundation rated research associate in the Department of Construction Management at Nelson Mandela University in Port Elizabeth. He has been involved in health and safety practice and research for several years with a PhD from the United States, focusing on alternative approaches to managing health and safety in construction. He's an advocate for incorporating health and safety in every aspect of construction and across all phases of construction projects. He has authored and edited several books and published over 200 research articles. He is involved in the International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction, CIB, Working Commission W99 for Safety, Health, and Welfare in Construction, W123, People in Construction, and he has served on the Advisory Council for Occupational Health and Safety of the South African Minister of Labor. He has worked on several research projects on the state of the construction industry in South Africa, including construction, health, and safety in South Africa, status and recommendations. His construction industry experience spans more than 2 decades. So please welcome Kathy and Theo for today's seminar. Over to you, Kathy and Theo.
Thank you, Mark, for that illustrious introduction. I sometimes wonder who those people actually are. Kathy, for sure, 100%. My case, well, I don't know if I've done all those things, but it's a great opportunity for both Kathy and I, and if Wayne joins later, to just speak about challenges and opportunities in South Africa, unleashing human potential, and giving an outline of some of the topical issues that are being discussed and being researched in South Africa and the neighboring region. However, we felt that before we actually talk about those areas, and there are obviously always opportunities for collaboration from anyone in this particular audience on any topic that you find of interest, is to actually place a context in which anything that happens in South Africa actually takes place. And one cannot avoid that, even though we are in a developing country. Some of the circumstances are unique, and researchers have to navigate that space effectively. And to give you some insight into that, I'm going to just briefly cover some of the aspects, bearing in mind that I may have to leave earlier, and Kathy will jump in wherever there are any items that she wants to add to, and we've discussed that. So should I leave, you will be in the capable hands of Professor Kathy Michelle. I think if one looks at South African history, for a long time, we had a situation where, based on political agendas and dispensations, we had a skewed environment which affected the higher education landscape. So we had certain institutions that were historically regarded, and we sometimes refer to them as the traditional, or the big five, or the big six, just depending on who you include. And those traditional universities had a well-established culture of research. They were also very, very well funded in terms of research, and they continue to lead the way in terms of research outputs on a national level. On the other hand, what has happened subsequent to 1994, when you know South Africa became a democratic republic, we obviously had to engage with addressing some of the inequalities of the past. And government then introduced an entire new higher education landscape, which recognizes the differences in institutions, but tried to level the playing field. So we have what we call still the traditional universities, like University of Cape Town, University of Stellenbosch, Pretoria, the Free State, University of the Witwatersrand, which is also in Johannesburg, and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Those were the traditional universities which today remain pretty much the way they were. What has happened is that we used to have a second tier of higher education institutions, technicons or polytechnics, maybe in the US known as some of the technical universities that we have, which have a proud heritage, MIT being the leading one. But these institutions were mostly vocationally focused and therefore never had a major research agenda, because a culture of research did not exist at those institutions. So there are quite a few of those. And then the third grouping is what they call comprehensive, which is a combination of what the traditional universities used to do and what the new technicons, which are universities of technology now, do. And so we've got these three types of institutions, and all competing now in the research landscape. So whereas in the traditional universities, you have a culture of research, in terms of the other institutions, there is a growing culture of research. And I think one needs to understand the differences between these institutions, all competing within the same unitary higher education landscape now. The reality also is that South Africa is a fairly small country, and it has a fairly limited research or pool of researchers. So if we had to make a list of the researchers in our disciplines, it would not be a huge list, but some of those are very prominent names who have made their contribution and their mark in the international arena, Kathy being no exception. The other aspect to also understand is that many of the institutions, and I think all over the world, use your research outputs, your performance in research, as a basis on which you gain promotion. So we know it as the promotion and tenure track in the US. In South Africa, when someone is called a professor at one university, given the three-tier landscape, it doesn't mean that that person actually qualified to earn that title in exactly the same way and that the metrics were uniform. So there's still that inequality between the institutions. So when someone says they are an assistant professor, they might actually equal the rank of a full professor at another university. So I thought that's important to bear in mind as well. And the way one earns professorship also differs between institutions. The third thing that I want to point out about these institutions is when it comes to funding of research, and we all know that research requires resources, each of the institutions has a very different approach determined by the institution. So for example, and I will touch on in the next slide, Kathy, on the subsidy system, is that how is that funding that comes from central government to universities distributed to the researchers? Again, given what kind of institution they are, determines how much funds actually lands in the hands of the researcher. So for example, with Kathy, and she can confirm this, at her university, it's regarded that research is part of the job, and therefore you shouldn't be incentivized or rewarded for actually doing what you're supposed to do. Given the background of the other institutions where there was no culture of research, there are methods and ways that they use to incentivize. So researchers at other institutions could get much more than what Kathy, for example, would do. Next slide, Kathy. So just to give you that background, that context, however, it also creates many, many opportunities, which makes South Africa rich in many senses. So what the government has done is to try and incentivize research at higher education institutions, and particularly those that they subsidize and fund. And most of the major universities receive government subsidy. So that subsidy, from a research point of view, is provided to the university based on a formula and based on the amount of research outputs or publications that you produce. So UCT and some of these top ones, for example, would get the bulk share of that subsidy based on what they produce. So for example, if Kathy published, and I'm using her as an example, one sole authored journal paper, she could get, or her university would get from government, about 100,000 to 125,000 South African rands per publication. So for that paper, that then would have a system within the university of how they would divide that up between what the university gets, what the research administration gets, what the faculty or college gets, what the department gets, and ultimately how much the researcher gets. And the researcher can then use those funds to go to a conference, etc. The second incentivization system, which is probably unique to South Africa, is all researchers in South Africa who obtain funding from government for research have to go through a rating process. And that rating system runs from A all the way through Z, depending on where you are at, the most common being C. The advantage of those rating systems is that the National Research Foundation, like the NSF in the US, actually top slices the entire research budget. And these researchers, depending on their ratings, are more favorably looked on when they apply for funds through research grants. Kathy, you want to talk about the limited African body of knowledge?
Briefly? I can do. Yeah.
Thank you.
So one of the wonderful opportunities that we do have in Africa is a very limited body of knowledge, certainly in our field, in construction and property, or the built environment, let me put it that way. There's certain fundamentals, obviously, that are global. I know Mark is an engineer, so your fundamental mathematics and physics and chemistry, that all remains the same. But the contextualization of the application of your engineering and built environment knowledge into Africa, there isn't really a significant amount. So there was a big student movement around about 2016, 2017, which called for decolonization of curricula across South African institutions. And that really spearheaded, I think, a lot more research being done that is Africa specific, with a very specific drive around developing that African body of knowledge so that it can be taught into our lecture rooms and to our students. Do you want me to carry on, Theo?
Okay, let me carry on with the urban poor, and then I'll touch on the rest of the items quickly.
Okay, thanks. So this comment that we put in actually stems from my seminar that I gave for Mark in April. So it's actually from my own research, is to say that, remember, we have a dual economy in Africa, both a formal economy and an informal economy. We have a large percentage of urban poor within our cities. But what is interesting to note when you look at the research that's being done by CIB members in the region, the fact that we have these African challenges does not necessarily drive the agenda. And what makes it such a wonderful opportunity for a researcher is that you can take your niche that you are in and you can choose to put a very private sector formal economy lens onto it. And in another space, you may choose to actually put that sort of social innovation or social infrastructure or the informal economy lens onto whatever it is that you're looking at. Which is just is actually really exciting from a researcher point of view. Theo?
Okay, thanks, Kathy. And then just to touch upon the last ones before I run, is that the opportunity is there for us to explore a wide range of research, and driven by the fact that we have a small pool of researchers and many of us work in multiple areas. There are, however, hubs of excellence where there is groundbreaking research done, but we can choose pretty much which area of research we actually want to work in. We can write our own agendas. We have our absolute freedom to create the spaces, and you've kind of heard from Mark's introduction in terms of my CV. Health and safety is my area. I also work in the space of construction, higher education. There's now construction 5.0, and nothing limits us from selecting those particular areas if that's what we want to work in, and we can find the resources to do so. The fact that money doesn't necessarily drive our research. If we see a need and it's an interest, we actually will go and conduct that research, even though we have limited funding, which is probably 90% of the time. Some of us are fortunate, others are not, but the research continues. And the major thing that Kathy can maybe add into is that we can impact our society because of our position, not only in on the continent, but I think also in terms of the influence that we have both nationally, but also globally. So those are the opportunities that I thought I'd just sketch for you so that you can understand the context in which the research that is emanating from South Africa, and particularly within the CIB space, comes from and influences. Kathy?
Thank you, Theo.
I'm going
Okay,
to have fun, so thank you, Kathy, for carrying on, and Mark, we'll touch bases again, and good luck to every one of you, and hopefully you'll work with Africans.
Yeah, thank you, Theo. Thank you very much for taking time. I know you have to run for your lecture, so thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay. See you, Theo.
Okay.
All right, so what we did, given the context and the very wide range or broad range of research that's happening in the area, what Theo and I tried to do was a little bit of thematic analysis, which is a wonderful qualitative data analysis tool. We gathered research topics from the CIB members, just very simply emailed them and asked them for a list of stuff that they are currently working on or have recently completed. And then I did a very quick thematic analysis on it. So I'm going to run you through, I think it's 5 themes with some discussion under each one. So in no particular order, the first theme is sustainable and affordable housing. if we cluster all of those together. And in that regard, there's quite a few projects either recently completed or currently running. So there's the SEA, what we call the SEA and the Net Zero Energy Project, which is sustainable, innovative, affordable housing, together with technological innovation. And that is focused on the development of homes for the urban poor. And specifically looking to design houses that are net zero energy. Broadening out from that, I gather that there's also work happening on development of sustainable, affordable housing for South Africa, because we have a severe housing shortage. That will include housing design and their implementation, both from a procurement and a construction point of view, into informal settlements. And part of that may also include installation of infrastructure and, how to actually negotiate with communities to have access in order to install what's needed, like running water and electricity and sewage and stormwater drainage. There's also work happening on neighborhood assessment frameworks for sustainability, but specifically focused on socioeconomically marginalized populations, as opposed to your more formal green rating tool, which is very similar to the LEED ND, the neighborhood LEED, or the BREEAM neighborhood one as well. There's also work happening on social infrastructure and amenities in human settlements, so how to actually support communities in that space. The second theme, as I said again, in no particular order, is technology and innovation in construction and urban development. So there appears to be quite a lot of research happening on technology as an enabler for sustainable outcomes. There's the construction 4.0, 5.0. So we know we're currently in the fourth industrial revolution, but there is a lot of indicators that we're actually moving towards the fifth already. There's also a lot of work happening on higher education in construction specifically, but also more broadly in the built environment professionals, around pursuing alternative pedagogies and how to integrate technology into our teaching space. Some work on drone technology and material passports within the circular economy for construction. There's work happening on integrating circularity into the urban environment, so it's slightly broader than just being building specific. And then one academic is working on resilient sustainability measurement and evaluation. They call it the RESUME model. The third theme, if I could just get it to move along. Sorry, Mark, it's glitching. There we go. The third one is sustainability and resilience in urban and built environments. Very broad range under this theme. Some work happening on urban smart farming around sustainability of food production. That's specifically the conversion of, looking at the conversion of warehouses and underutilized office space to indoor hydroponic farming. Rainwater harvesting systems for water scarce areas. I don't know how many of you know, but it was a few years ago, just before COVID, that the city of Cape Town actually seriously faced day zero in terms of our water supply. And as a result of that very real experience of actually really having a countdown to when the city would actually run out of water, sparked a lot more research happening in rainwater harvesting and how we can be smarter with our use of water. Urban water reuse planning for resilience, that also comes from that. Disaster management and a lot of work that happened on the COVID-19 response, but a lot of the COVID-19 response, the lessons learned from that can be rolled out more broadly into disaster management. And then resilient cities. How do we actually design and construct resilient cities, specifically looking at the interplay between density, design, and the well-being of communities. The fourth theme is health, safety, and inclusivity in construction. So there we have, this is a lot of the work of Theo and John Smallwood, and now retired, but used to be the work as well of Professor Paul Bowen. So construction health and safety, but that is not just your traditional health and safety. It also includes mental health, stress and coping, and the work of Professor Bowen, which focused a lot on the prevalence of HIV and HIV/AIDS and strategies and mechanisms that could be put in place for construction workers to support them in that regard. There's work happening on inclusive and accessible public transport for women and people with reduced mobility. There's also work happening on universal access and design for people with disabilities. A lot of research happening on construction industry development with a focus on gender and the more broader context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then there is research happening, but obviously this one, the last one, becomes a bit sensitive because of the nature of what you're actually looking at, but there is research happening on the construction mafia and extortion and just generally corruption within the industry. And the fifth theme I put under energy infrastructure and sustainability more broadly. So there is a lot of research happening on alternative energy, things like nuclear power and your renewable energy like solar and wind, and some on hydroelectric. A lot of research on sustainable infrastructure delivery, and some research, I think it's one researcher in the CIB kind of network is working on the development of a sustainability rating tool for government buildings in South Africa. Not listed as a bullet point, but there is obviously quite a lot of research as well just happening on environmental sustainability within property assets or the built facility around energy reduction, energy consumption rather, and water consumption as well. But yeah, and I think those are my themes. Mark, I know it's short, sharp, sweet, and to the point, but that is pretty much a whirlwind of what everyone in the region is up to.
Oh, that's great, Kathy. Thanks a lot. I think that sets the stage for a lot of good questions. I don't think Wayne has joined yet, right? So, okay, if he comes in, we'll get him engaged. But both you and Theo have raised a lot of good points, and I'm sure there are some questions coming up. So let me open to the audience. If you have any questions that you want to ask, please open your mic and ask away. I cannot see everybody's hand, so maybe if something is hiding, I won't see that. But while you're thinking, let me start off my set of questions and then jump in as you guys think, okay? So, starting with what Theo was talking about earlier, and he's not here to respond, but perhaps, you can answer on his behalf, particularly about, higher education situation in South Africa. And within that, I was wondering that, if you look at the US landscape, we find that we have very few domestic students getting into higher education, whereas we have a lot of international students from all over the world taking advantage of the education system and coming here for master's and PhD and other higher studies. So I was wondering, what is the landscape in South Africa in this regard? Do you see domestic students wanting to go more for a master's, PhDs, or do you see more international cohort in that?
I think it varies. I can only really speak for my own institution. I think maybe I can't speak for the whole country. But at UCT, if you'd asked me this question 5 years ago about our postgraduate cohort, and I'm talking about now research masters and PhD students, the majority were non-South African, probably coming from countries like Zambia, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, primarily. But I think that trend has actually changed in the last 3 to 4 years. I mean, if I look at my own PhD students, if you'd asked me 10 years ago, the majority were foreign, maybe one South African, but now that's completely flipped. The majority of my PhD students are South African. And I think I actually only have one foreigner out of 7. So that trend appears to be changing. I think anyway. So it's as, more and more people within South Africa actually have master's degrees. So you find what is more popular in the built environment disciplines among South Africans is to actually do a taught master's degree as opposed to a research master's. So when you look at the taught master's programs, certainly in our department here at the University of Cape Town, which offers a master's in project management and a master's in property, or in American language, it's probably a master's in real estate. The majority of those students are South African. And that's about upskilling themselves, from where they are at their undergraduate to their honors degree, that, where their career is taking them, so that there may be an engineer who's now needing project management skills, or it's a quantity surveyor or an architect who feels that they need more grounding in terms of real estate development and finance and valuation. So it's almost like mid-career training. So the taught master's programs are very popular. And maybe
Actually, we are finding that trend here as well, and we are finding ways of attracting more domestic students to pursue masters and PhD. And I think you mentioned about taught masters. We call it course only masters, with the same thing. And we have seen that there's a big surge in students wanting to choose that option as opposed to thesis track. So that seems to map quite well. But following up on that thought, Theo mentioned about research funding, and again, I think he mentioned 7 or 8 universities that were more research inclined as opposed to some of the others. So do you see that the funding support that is provided is more to those universities than the other universities that he was counting as, polytechnic, or I think he used the term second-tier universities?
He's very kind to say, I'm surprised he said second tier, because I would prefer to have, being at one of the traditional Big Five institutions, I don't see Nelson Mandela and the other, what he referred to as the second tier as necessarily being second tier. In some cases, in our field anyway, talking about built environment, they potentially are probably more research active than some of the traditional universities. Different in the engineering space, Mark, because your traditional 5 or 6 universities, that is the heart, the hub of the engineering research that's happening within the country. If I look at what the engineers within my faculty at the University of Cape Town, the kind of research and their level of standing, their NRF rating, that rating system relative to what Theo refers to as the second tier, they're pretty much world class. I mean, UCT is fortunate because of who it is and its history. It has the highest number of A-rated researchers in the country located in one institution. They tend to be in your traditional disciplines. So medicine, law, all your sciences, the engineers, humanities as well. Oh, there's Wayne. So I think the big thing to understand from a government, because government is quite constrained in terms of the amount of money that it has, and so I think that the cake hasn't really grown very much, but who's actually taking slices of the cake has increased significantly. So for us at UCT, we actually don't rely on government for research purposes. I don't rely on the National Research Foundation funding. I seek my funding elsewhere. So
I was going to ask a question.
British Council, Royal Academy of Engineering, Horizons, EU funding, which requires strong collaborations, obviously, with partner institutions around the world, because the funding might be, say, from the Royal Academy of Engineering, it might be Africa focused, but it requires 1 or 2 UK universities to be collaboration partners with you. So yeah, because the pie, the slice of the cake that you get from government funding is actually pretty small. Yeah. That's just
No,
me.
yeah,
That's me
I was going to
personally.
ask that as a follow-up question, as in, what are some of the other funding sources? But you just answered that question as well. But Wayne, welcome. It's good that you could join. By the way, just so that
Yeah,
everybody knows, this is Professor Wayne Dry. He is a senior lecturer and director of School of Built Environment at Nelson Mandela University. So please welcome Professor Wayne Dry. Wayne, do you want to add anything else to what Kathy just mentioned?
Hello, Mark. Yes, sorry, man. I was battling to get in. My apologies, colleagues, for that. What Kathy's saying at the Nelson Mandela University, most of the colleagues mainly depend on the funding that is being received from the Department of Higher Education and Training through the research publications and that. There are individuals that, however, as Kathy had just said, that get their funding from outside, but that is with our university being a young university in the bigger context, and it being made up of a traditional university together as with what we called a technicon back in the day. Now it's a comprehensive university. So the research space is still young, and all of that, and that is where that comes in, Mark. Just to add to that, say there are some of the colleagues that do get their funding from EU funding from UK and the like, and that. But it's mainly from the government slice that Kathy had mentioned.
Okay. I'm sure our global audience would also want to know that what are some of the research collaboration opportunities that exist in South Africa that researchers from around the world can perhaps join in?
I think, yeah, from my point of view, I would say that the opportunities are endless, but obviously it would need to align with my own research focus and research agenda. But if you are wanting to collaborate with researchers in South Africa, I would say please just drop myself or Wayne or Theo or all three of us as your CIB, since we are your CIB regional directors, just drop us an email outlining kind of exactly your research focus, your particular research interest, and then based on that, I'm very happy to forward you and put you in contact with colleagues that I know in South Africa are doing research in that particular area, and hopefully something comes from that. The other thing as well, I would say to any international academic is that often in everyone's space, there are funders like the Royal Academy of Engineering or the British Council or the Australian government, or I don't know about the US, sorry, Mark, where specifically there may be thrusts that research is focused on developing countries. Often they have a theme or a thrust within that. And if that is the case, please don't be scared to reach out to us in South Africa. I know my research unit would be more than willing to collaborate in order to assist an overseas partner. Sometimes we are the PI, but more often than not, the UK partner is actually, and some of my European universities that I work with, they are the principal investigator and we are simply a collaborator. And there's a small portion of the budget will come to us involved in data collection and data analysis from a South African point of view. But it helps the international academic as well to secure research funding, because often they're looking for an Africa partner. I know on one of our projects that we're currently running within my research unit, it's a big one. It's about 2.5–3 million rands worth of research funding. We are the PI at the University of Cape Town, but our collaborators are also in Namibia and Botswana and the University of Johannesburg, and a couple of industry partners as well. So some of the funders want industry partners in the developing country. So again, you may need a South African academic collaborator to actually connect you with the industry partner, so that there's a very tangible benefit around the research going back into society. What we have learned, I can share if the community are interested, is that often the big international funders would prefer to have a South African as the key collaborator when you're wanting to reach out into Southern Africa. Probably just because there's a greater level of market transparency and a greater level of trust in terms of the funding coming into the academic institutions within South Africa. Yeah.
Interesting you should say that, Kathy. The number of different institutions that you mentioned around the world. In the US, we have the State Department and the National Science Foundation. They have some dedicated programs for South Africa. And we have actually participated on, I think, 2 or 3 such proposals that were initiated by the US State Department. So there are opportunities for collaboration from the US side as well. Wayne, do you want
so really the door is open, I think, is really the message that I would like to, put out into the community and say, if you're wanting to collaborate and you don't know who to speak to in South Africa, you're more than welcome to contact Wayne and I or Theo.
Indeed, indeed.
I just want to, Mark, if I could, add on to what Kathy is saying. If we look at, there's an untapped market into Africa, where also the opportunities are there. And just to latch onto that, Mark, you remember the project we went to go and visit, where I had taken you guys in Lambe municipality. That project has now come to an end, but the University of Potsdam from Germany, they're coming now in the middle of November, wanting to come and extend that project into further research into that sustainable and eco housing and looking at how best they can do that. They are excited about getting involved in that further, but opportunities really are endless. There are so many. Particularly, as I say, that the research space, particularly at our university, and I know that a couple of other universities in the region where I find myself, with it being young, and there are researchers, international researchers that are wanting to get involved into that space. But anything we can guide and advise as to a direction research focuses into where it is that we're needing to go in that.
Excellent, excellent. Let me see if our audience has any questions. If you have any questions, just open your mic and ask. Anybody? Well, okay, here's a question coming in. Dave, why don't you open your mic and ask a question? Dave, can you open your mic, or should I read it loud for everybody?
I think he has written in his chat that he doesn't have a mic today. So
okay, all right. So let me just read it out. No worries, Dave. So Africa is a huge continent. How are any topics different around the continent, such as North Africa versus Sahara, or Southern Africa and West Africa? Different countries now that had differing colonial backgrounds, English, French, Portuguese speaking countries, etc. Are these or other factors significant around the continent, particularly in terms of body of knowledge? Transparency was just mentioned. Is there a sense that transparency occurs more in certain countries or regions on the African continent? I do not have a mic. Oh, sorry, he doesn't have a mic.
Okay, so there's, if I may, Wayne, there's quite a few questions embedded in that. So I'll answer the transparency one first, because I think it's shorter and it's quicker. The best place to understand the measures of transparency is there's a real estate transparency index that's published by, I think it's McKinsey Global. And that'll give you an idea. So South Africa is considered the most transparent because you have access to data and the market is fairly open in that regard, followed very closely by Kenya in East Africa and Nigeria in West Africa. And then after that, it scales off very, very quickly. So that kind of gives you an idea of transparency. And the transparency speaks to really actually governance processes that are in place. So when I said that in terms of the funding, it's around the financial controls that are in place within the universities in South Africa that are King 4, King 5 compliant. So there's a measure of trust that when that research money actually comes to a university within South Africa, that the money will be spent in accordance with the budget. There won't be fruitless and wasteful expenditure, and that whatever money is not spent will be returned to the funder.
Yep.
And the auditing processes are all in place. So that's what we're referring to there.
Maybe I can add to that, Kathy.
Yeah.
The reporting structure on that funding is also very rigid and it's well policed.
Yeah, very well policed. Okay, then yes, thank you, Dave, for acknowledging that Africa is a huge continent. It is enormous. It looks small on the map, but actually it is massive geographically, with 54 countries across the continent. There are significant differences. For those of us that do research in Africa, we will always advise that it's very hard to do a project that covers the whole continent. Actually start with a region. So Southern Africa is a region all in its own, and it goes up as far as Zambia, maybe even Malawi, and East Africa, West Africa, and then North Africa. North Africa tends to align itself in terms of its research agenda and what's happening more closely with the Middle East. So, we tend to talk about the Middle East, North Africa region because it's north of the Sahara. There's a good reason for that, and it's because of the language. A lot of those countries across North Africa speak Arabic. So, another good benchmark is to look at the African Union. What are the official languages of the African Union? It's English, French, and Arabic. It gives you a good idea. There's quite a fair amount of similarity, only because the institutional structures that are playing out within society as a result of the colonial domination are very similar when you're looking at countries that were all colonized by the same colonizer. So if you look at the UK, then you see similarity between South Africa, Lesotho, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Zambia, Malawi, Kenya. You'll start to feel the same kind of institutional structures. The way in which the built environment is set up with the professions and everything is very similar. The German Southwest Africa, or Namibia as it's called now, is very similar to South Africa, even though it was colonized by the Germans. The British had a very strong influence in Namibia post-World War II. The Portuguese, which is, aside from some of the smaller islands, is Angola and Mozambique. It's hard to tell because both of those countries have had fairly extensive civil war, particularly Mozambique, for about 20-25 years, and are only just starting to reach a peaceful state and starting to rebuild. And then obviously immediately you start to hit a bit of a language barrier. Francophile or Francophone Africa is very hard to get into unless you speak French. Very, very hard, even to make connections with academics in those universities. So, that is Mauritius, the DRC, Congo, Burundi, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, and going all the way around the bulge. We do, in my field, I do have, and in the real estate field, we do have relatively good connections there through the African Real Estate Society. And for myself, through the Africa Facilities Management Association, where there's now a growing conscious effort to include Francophile Africa into our conversations and our narrative and our research that we're doing. So it is quite different depending on where you are. So I don't know if I've really, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. That was a good question. Anybody else?
So Asha, if you lived in Cote d'Ivoire, then we should be saying, bonjour Dave, comment ça va?
Yeah.
Merci, there you go.
Great. Any other questions? Well, so while you are again thinking about your questions, Kathy, I want to pick on something that you mentioned earlier, when you were sharing the 5 different areas, the thought was coming to my mind that, there was reference made to limited body of knowledge in Africa, and the effort for decolonization of curricula and so on. So what I wanted to pick up on was that, when you show the 5 different areas of focus, sustainable innovation, tech and innovation, sustainability and resilience, health and safety, energy and infrastructure, and sustainability, and so on, what comes to my mind is your last seminar on Wakanda. And I want to pick your mind on that again. That was very interesting, comparison that you had made. So those of you who don't know Wakanda, it's a mythical society in Africa, and if you have seen the Black Panther Marvel movies, you would get a good glimpse of what that vision is. But you had given a very exciting seminar last time. So my question is that when in countries that you see a lot of disparity, economic disparity in the population, on one hand, to think about all the sustainability issues and all the advancement, the import of technology or application of technology gets to be not properly distributed, let me put it this way, among the population. So what are your thoughts on that? And in reference to Wakanda, it's a vision, but how do you make that happen in the South African context or in African context as a broad base, given the disparity?
I think we're still grappling with that a little bit. And I think I would have raised it in that seminar, is that I think when you're looking, remember, you've got the formal and the informal. So you've got those that have the access and to be smart, if you want to use it, or digital is not necessarily a challenge. The challenge comes in addressing that digital divide, especially with technological innovation. The one thing that we do need to address is the social sustainability. So if we don't get that right, so this is my own research agenda and my own personal opinion, is that if we don't get that right, it's going to be hard to leverage what we need from an environmental and economic, it's almost like the people pillar in the People, Planet, Profit. It's like the people pillar is actually more important. And when you start looking at the street level of what's actually happening in African cities, and it'll vary from city to city and from country to country, the innovation is happening, and it's being driven by the people, where they can see that the technology is there, and that they are able to actually use the technology to make their lives easier, to achieve operational efficiency. So the one thing that's very interesting in Africa is that if you're working in a collaborative project with a lot of African partners, don't rely on email. You're better off setting up a WhatsApp group. And I know everyone's going to say Poppy Act, but I can assure you that more research conversations happen through the WhatsApp group than they ever will through the email. And the reason is, one, access to needing the laptop and needing a PCU, and actually needing to sit down somewhere and do what you need to do. But pretty much a lot of people have got smartphones, and a lot of people have got WhatsApp. So if you set up the WhatsApp group, the research conversation becomes a lot more fluid and a lot quicker. So the example I will give you, which is very real because I've lived it, is the Africa Facilities Management Association. We established that and got it off the ground through a WhatsApp group of about 7 or 8 academics and 3 practitioners. It wasn't through email. It was only like a year after we'd been talking on WhatsApp during COVID that we actually started to connect a little bit on email. But even then, the default is still WhatsApp, because everybody has access to WhatsApp, or most people have got access to WhatsApp. So that's an example. Another example, for example, in Kenya, is not everybody has a street address. If you live in an informal settlement, you don't have a utility bill. you need a utility bill to open a bank account because of international banking regulations and laws. But if you live in a shack, you don't have a street address, or a utility bill that actually the postman doesn't deliver anything to your shack, so you can't actually open a bank account, which then excludes a lot of people from having access to the sort of more formal economy. So in Kenya, for example, they've actually created a second currency that is entirely digital and is handled through your phone. They call it the M-Pesa. So when you speak to local people in Kenya, they do a lot of trade. They buy their petrol, their food, even the informal traders on the side of the road. You can buy your fruit and vegetables using this virtual currency that the informal economy has actually created for themselves so that they can trade.
That is very interesting.
It's quite interesting. I mean, I'm sure the banks are not too happy about it, and it's very, very definitely not developed world concept. But when
that's
you
the solution
and
to
I've
the
heard
problem.
now there are some of the taxis in Cape Town, for example, are offering free Wi-Fi
Okay.
in the taxi. So there's a little bit of innovation and entrepreneurship. You know, you might pay a little bit more to sit in the minibus taxi in the rush hour traffic, but there's free Wi-Fi while you're in the taxi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Wayne, do
So
you want to add anything to that?
No, Mark, I think Kathy had covered that. I can just say, just to add to that, around the banking system, what particularly happens in South Africa, when it comes to that, in the informal settlement space, where they also are not addresses, where they use the councillor as their guide, that the councillor can confirm that Kathy does stay in this region, and that is how they get through certain aspects.
you do know that South African engineers invented the smart meters for electricity and water.
Oh, I
So
didn't know that.
you pay as you go. You pay as you go. You know, so you don't just automatically have electricity. You know, you actually go and buy your electricity at the petrol station or wherever. You can buy it online if you have access to that, and you put your 10-digit code in, and the lights come on.
Okay. No, I'd not heard of that. That's good to know. Yes.
It
Well,
was very
folks,
during the day zero thing. If you had a smart meter on your water, because each household was only allocated 6 kiloliters or whatever it was per person, and once you'd used your water ration for the day, they switch your water off.
But also just to add to that, Mark, it comes from the time when and this is now more in Kathy's field, when the RDP homes were or the low income homes were constructed, and the people that were the beneficiaries, if they had to have a utility bill, they would run that up into thousands and not be able to contribute to that or to pay. And that is where that had come from, where they then were limited. They were given free tokens, a certain amount for free for the month, and beyond that they would have to purchase, and that was where that design had come from.
I see.
But it's very good because you can actually see the little meter, you know, ticking down. So you know when you switch, from my point of view, when you switch the tumble dryer on, you cringe because you can actually see the amount of electricity that it's actually consuming.
I think that's a very good way of looking at, you know, sustainable energy consumption. Just like we have on our smartphones, you know, you can purchase number of units and actually run out of it. I think it's the same concept. That's very nice, actually. Well,
and the thing is, it is something that is not just a man in the street. If everybody is buying into this, most people are buying into this concept of determining how much I would be using and not be shocked with it. So it's
right.
And if you're on a limited income, it actually allows you to budget
Budget
very well. Very strict budgeting, you know, on you have however many rand per month for electricity, and that is it.
And a good control on wastage.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, folks, any other questions? I have a few, but I want to give our audience a chance. Well, we have some more time. So if anybody any questions coming up? All right, so let me expand this discussion that we were just having a little bit further. And Kathy, you mentioned about water scarcity, and I think I was visiting Stellenbosch during those times, and I know that how bad the situation was in Cape Town. And so my question was going to be, what measures were taken to sort of recover from that impending calamity of water shortage?
I think, if I recall correctly, and I stand to be corrected on this, I think they've increased the storage capacity of some of the dams. And there are plans, I think, or there were, for the construction of a desalination plant. But beyond that, I mean, in the run-up to Day Zero, there was very big public awareness campaigns around water usage and water consumption. And as a result of that, those that could afford it, you put in JoJo tanks to rainwater, to harvest your rainwater and store it, so that you can use that now in the summer months to actually water your garden rather than using drinkable water from the tap. To be honest, I still haven't removed my bricks that got put in the toilet cistern. They're still in the toilet cistern. So that was, I mean, I know it sounds like a strange thing, but the toilet cistern fills up, and if it's an old one, it takes 35 or 40 liters of water, drinking water that actually, is flushed away. A lot of the shopping centers, the big corporate shopping centers and that kind of thing, they, like the V&A waterfront, for example, they capture the water that's being expelled by the air conditioning, which is lost usually to the atmosphere in terms of evaporation, and they recycle that through the shopping center for washing hands and flushing toilets. And I think at the beginning of this year, their black water recycling plant that they've built has now come online. So there's that. I mean, Old Mutual Park, which is a big corporate headquarters here in Cape Town, I think it's about 5,000 people work there. They are completely off-grid now, with solar panels and a water recycling system. It's great. Great black water. So they recycle all the water back through. So that's sort of closed, almost like a closed loop reticulation system. They have a very limited draw from the municipal main. I've noticed that even in the shopping centers, none of the centers have put the hand washing taps, for example, back onto full flow. It's still a spray.
Waterless, spray.
Still a spray, a very fine mist instead of a full flow of water. So a lot of those measures that were put in as we faced Day Zero have not been rolled back to the pre, the pre-status that we had. Yeah.
So that seems to be the new normal for Day Zero. That is very interesting. We are running out of time, but let me give our audience one more chance if there's a burning question to be asked. Well, as always, I close the session with my question. So I put one question for the end, and that is that, Kathy, you mentioned about 4.0, construction 4.0, and that we are also looking now at construction 5.0. And actually there was construction 6.0 is also being discussed. So my question being, again, coming back to the disparity between within the society in terms of adoption of technology. So that brings the question, a couple of questions actually. So number one, I think you might have touched upon it in this seminar or the previous one about indigenous methods being used for different building construction or water conservation or replenishing the underground water storage and so on. But the question I want to ask is, in construction 4.0, the focus is more on technology adoption. Whereas if you look at construction 5.0, that is more in terms of, it's more human-centric, sustainability, resilience. The way I like to say it is that it's one step higher in the Maslow's hierarchy. So the question comes that if there's already disparity in the society, then utilizing 4.0 itself is difficult. So how do you start thinking about 5.0 in that situation?
I would say that built environment professionals need to be S-centric in all that they do. So, we've got the ESGs. So whenever you're doing a project, think of the people. Just be a little bit more S-centric in all that you do. So even when you adopt technology, be aware of the unintended consequences of what you're doing. So a lot of the tech adoption is by the built environment professionals. So, your use of BIM, digital twins, drones on sites, for example, to do site measurements, that kind of thing. You will see less, I think, technology adoption in the actual construction process. Only because there's a lot of resistance to that in the market, because there's a perception that, for example, using robotics to actually build is depriving unskilled labor of access to an economic opportunity. So, there's a bit of a trade-off here. So you might want to use the technology because, yes, you could do it faster or quicker, but just think of the S. Think of the social implications of what you are doing.
Right,
So
indeed.
use the technology, but I would actually challenge the construction. If I look at construction, I would challenge the construction company to say, well, use the technology, but can you take some of your labor force and actually train them and upskill them in the process so that they can operate that technology, or they can maintain it, or, something along those lines? Is there an opportunity to upskill your existing labor force through the technology, through the adoption of the technology, rather than economic exclusion as a result of the technology adoption? And then for the built environment professionals, which is what I say to my own students, in every project that you do, because of where you are located in a developing country, you need to be aware of the social impact of what you are doing into society. It's not just a moral thing, it's actually a professional, ethical thing.
Indeed. Wayne?
He
You can
agrees.
see there, I concur with that. I'm fully, that is, and that is where, Mark, where I come in, being a qualified carpenter, and being able to identify with that. That is why I can only but applaud. That is where we need to be in that space. And particularly in the setup within South Africa, where there is where the unemployment numbers run through the roof.
43%.
40%?
The built environment, the built environment sector is one that is looked upon to reduce that. And this is exactly where Kathy comes in with that human centric, with that human element that needs to come in. So that is one of the aspects that we need to look at.
Well, to both of you, and Theo had to leave earlier. Thank you very much. This has been indeed very, very fascinating seminar. A lot of questions, and I do appreciate that you, all three of you, took time to address those questions and for giving a wonderful seminar. So all of you, all the audience, if you could just open your mics and give them a big round of applause for this seminar.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for the opportunity. Once again, my apologies for being late. I battled technology.
Yeah, that worked out just fine. Thank you, Wade.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. We'll sign off now, and we'll see you all next Friday with another exciting.
Thank you so much. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye.
I look forward to seeing you in Purdue next year, Mark.
Yes, we're looking forward to that.
Yeah.